further about this in relation to what I term root health in a more general sense and its management. My co-author is Evan Johnson. Evan Johnson followed my early work and showed root infection occurred. He was the discoverer of that important finding. He continues my work after retirement. He took over my lab program. So I must credit him in large part to what I'm presenting here in this particular presentation. So I'm calling this the consequences of root damage by HLB. And the topics are HLB-induced root loss and root growth. I talked about in generalities, but I'm going to talk in more specifics. And its implications in, again, what I call root health management, which I think is the foundation of managing this disease in the field. Silvio talked about rootstocks and the fact that they almost universally become infected in very similar ways. So I'm going to talk about rootstocks. I'm going to talk about the root loss that occurs, that differs on different rootstocks, and then the considerations of these findings for new plantings and whether to choose some of our more novel new rootstocks in our programs. So I showed fibrous root loss in a different way in the morning, but this is a more general root system view of the differences between the early phase, what Evan Johnson termed the early phase. That is 30 to 50% loss that occurs initially, and then what he calls late phase after the canopy starts to decline. You can see clear differences in the fibrous root density on these trees. I don't think it takes too much imagination. But something wholly unexpected was when he inserted these cages, he calls them cages, below the ground, much like Silvio talked about pruning the top of the tree. This, in effect, is when you're inserting this cage into a hole that's a root pruning type of effect or treatment below the ground. And you extract these cages after about 60 days, 45 to 60 days. And you compare healthy trees with declining trees, you see something quite unexpected. And that is the new root growth in these cages is similar. But the root density that was being supported outside of that cage is obviously very different between the healthy and the declining trees. So what I call a survival mode is being expressed here by the HLB-infected trees. That is, roots are fundamental to the tree's survival because they act in water and nutrient uptake to maintain their viability and next generation of producing flowers and fruit set. So trees in a survival mode means you've got a lot of root production occurring on HLB-infected trees. And so what's the implications of that? Well, just to convince you about this root growth stimulation process, he calls it, he inoculated trees in these rhizoboxes. In October 2015, he inoculated these trees in rhizoboxes. And the HLB tree here was inoculated and was PCR negative at the beginning of the trial, and then the healthy tree next door was uninoculated. These are Swingle citromelo seedlings planted in these boxes. And you can see the root growth on this plexiglass front panel here. So with time after inoculation, 1 month, you see root growth occurring here in both cases, pretty much the same for that month. With the following month, you see maybe some hints that the HLB inoculated tree, which is still PCR negative, is starting to grow more roots, or at least as many roots as the healthy tree still. But then by 3 months, very convincingly, after the tree is PCR positive, you see more roots in the HLB inoculated than the healthy tree. So root growth is apparently being stimulated by the infection process. By month 7, a whole reversal of this process has occurred. Root dieback begins, and here you have a disappearance of roots that were there previously compared to the healthy tree. So again, this stimulation is then followed by a root death. This is a cycle of production of roots and then loss of roots that is very costly to the tree, and I'll show you the evidence for that. Again, roots disappear by month 8. So what's the consequence of this root production and root loss in HOB trees? Is that root growth is stimulated and that root turnover is increased and root lifespan is decreased significantly in a large way from 9 to 12 months typically on a healthy tree to 4 months. And that this represents what we call a large investment or cost to the tree that is reflected in carbohydrates used for root replacement and diverted from leaves and fruit in their sustainment. So you have these sort of phenomena on the trees of leaf loss, premature leaf loss, but more importantly, premature fruit loss. So what has happened here is that this peduncle has collapsed. You have this necrotic area at the base. So this fruit is what I call aborting on the tree and then falling prematurely. So that's the cost. It's diversion of carbohydrate to root growth from the sustainment of fruits. And you see that as this fruit on the ground in a very early symptomatic tree. So this HOB infection process leads to premature leaf and fruit drop. So stimulating new root growth as a principle is not sustaining yield, and it's reducing yield, in fact. So it's better to sustain root longevity and minimize stress on roots than to do things that would stimulate roots. And the way you do that is the obvious, as I talked about this morning. You maintain optimal conditions for supplying roots with nutrients and water. And that management is foundationed by the choice of rootstock, the quality of the soil, the pH of the soil, as I mentioned, drainage of the soil, irrigation practices, irrigation water quality. I mentioned biocarbonates being very important, and then this all culminates in the planting site and the success of the tree in the early stages of its life. So the question, as Silvio was touching on in his talk, is rootstocks, do they differ in their behavior? And if so, can we select new rootstocks that contribute more to the sustainment of what we call tolerance of HOB, infection of roots and root loss? And that starts with starting to look at many rootstocks to see whether they become infected or not. And in Silvio's studies and our studies, Evan Johnson's studies, all the rootstocks that have been investigated become infected. Evan looked at 17 rootstocks, Silvio many more, but among the two laboratories we have as many as 50 rootstocks that have been looked at. So the question of whether new rootstocks maintain larger root systems, is that going to contribute in a way to tolerance? Can these rootstocks, these new rootstocks that are more tolerant, delay early or late season or late development of root loss? And new rootstocks under evaluation at our field trial in Central Florida, how are they behaving in a detailed study that I'll present the results for. So here we have Swingle as our standard rootstock comparison, and a few other called somatic hybrids of rootstocks, Shangsha 50-7 trifoliate, or Clio and with Carrizo as two comparisons that behave like Swingle. And then we have these two UFR rootstocks. One's called Orange 19 or UFR 4. The other is Orange 4 or UFR 2. And what Evan is showing you here in colors, different colors, is the rootstock UFR 4 starts with a higher density of roots than Swingle and maintains them for a time and then starts to decline in root density after over a year. So this is a long-term study of root production. UFR4 behaves differently from Swingle and from UFR2. It increases in its root density over time. And so that looks to be a positive result on the face of it. Or maybe it's just larger production of roots all along becomes the favored way of creating tolerance. Let's see what happens. So these two rootstocks differing from swingo, we can sort of classify into two behaviors. One is the higher root density, UFR2, has early phase root production that is higher, maintains more functional root density, higher photosynthate cost, carbohydrate cost, as we know, is the to support this process. But in late phase, what Evan observed was this sudden collapse of the canopy that was accompanied by a sudden loss of roots, 70 to 80% root loss. So he concluded from that study, that censusing, that more roots is not the answer. So stimulating roots is not the answer. More root production is not the answer per se, at least under those dynamics. The dynamics of UFR4 are different. The early phase growth is more like swingo, but then roots continue to gain in their density over time. The canopy decline on this particular rootstock of sweet orange varieties is slower. So is this a sign that the extent that the tolerance or life of that tree is going to be extended? In the late phase, you have a delay in canopy decline and because of a delay in root loss. So behavior below the ground is being reflected above the ground. So is this all based on greater root longevity, and is that a trait that we want to select for in our new rootstocks? What he observed in this particular season, 2015-16, when he went out and measured fruit drop under these trees on different rootstocks, is that greater root longevity, density for water nutrient uptake as we connected to, that fruit drop was lowest on UFR4. So we have a relationship between this root production behavior and less fruit drop. Only one season, but some signs that maybe there's some connection between development of root systems, their production of roots, and their tolerance. So the question to carry this on becomes, can the rootstocks help? Should we be developing rootstocks that behave differently from these standards? That behave differently from these standards. Our standards here, Clio, Sour, Carrizo, Volk, they all lose roots at the same level that Swingle does. But can this rootstock behavior, as in UFR4, of increased rootstock root mass over time, be equated with more tolerance to HLB? And should we, when we find this sort of behavior, start recommending this type of rootstock immediately? And the answer is no. We don't have enough of a history of track record for these rootstocks yet, our new rootstocks. Even though they have this potential for improvement, we only currently recommend existing rootstocks. We do not recommend the newer rootstocks from at least UFR varieties. From the USDA, we have more track record. We have some recommendation of those varieties. So in summary, root health is foundation, its management is foundation to HLB management. We consider in managing HLB that we're managing not just the canopy and its symptoms, but the root growth and sustainment, longevity underground. And you adjust for the limited root uptake capacity of the root system by timing irrigation cycles, fertigating, reducing other stresses on the root system, including not just biotic stresses, but abiotic stresses like pathogens and pests are very important in their interaction on HLB. So with that, thank you very much again.